Carolina thought she had everything: a perfect life, a perfect husband, and the admiration of everyone around her. But when doubts crept into her mind, her world began to unravel. Hiding under the bed, Carolina witnessed a betrayal that shattered her heart. Her suspicions deepened, and what she discovered was more horrifying than she ever imagined. As the truth emerged, the facade of her marriage crumbled, revealing a web of lies, deceit, and dangerous secrets. Carolina is left to decide: should she run away from the nightmare or fight to uncover the full extent of the darkness surrounding her? If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Beneath the shimmering glow of a perfect life, Carolina's world teetered on the edge of a dark abyss. Her suspicions, once just a whisper in the back of her mind, had grown into a consuming fear. That's why she found herself hiding under the bed that evening, trembling with a mixture of dread and determination. The coolness of the marble floor pressed into her skin, but the icy chill in her heart outweighed any discomfort. She lay there, silent as a shadow, waiting for the moment that would shatter her carefully constructed reality. As the front door creaked open, her pulse quickened. She listened intently as Roberto's familiar footsteps echoed down the hall, growing louder with each step. The door swung open, and there he was, just as she had feared. But he wasn't alone. The soft murmur of a woman's voice floated through the air, slicing through Carolina's heart like a knife. The sight of those red heels, so distinct and unmistakable, sent a wave of nausea rolling through her. She knew exactly who they belonged to. The woman's voice was smooth, laced with a sickening sweetness. "Are you certain she suspects nothing?" she asked, her tone dripping with confidence. Carolina's breath hitched in her throat as she heard Roberto's cruel laugh, a sound that echoed in her ears like the crack of a whip. "Carolina is clueless," he replied coldly. She would never suspect a thing. His words, so casual and dismissive, sent a searing pain through her chest. Silent tears traced paths down her cheeks as she watched the man she loved entwined with another, their passion igniting a fire of betrayal deep within her soul. The sudden ring of Roberto's phone broke the trance, pulling them apart. "I understand. I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said, his tone serious, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The woman gathered her things, and with a final lingering kiss, they both left the room. For a long time, Carolina didn't move. Her heart was a storm of emotions: hurt, anger, humiliation, but above all, a newfound resolve. Slowly, she emerged from her hiding place, her mind reeling from the shock. Yet her eyes gleamed with a determination she had never known. "This isn't over," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible but filled with steely resolve. Gone was the naive woman who had been blinded by love and luxury. In her place stood a woman ready to fight for the truth, to reclaim her dignity, no matter the cost. She settled into the plush white armchair, her thoughts drifting back to the beginning -8 months ago, when everything seemed so perfect. She could still see that night vividly, the night she first met Roberto at a charity gala. He had dazzled everyone with his charm, but it was Carolina who had captured his attention. She had worn a striking red dress, a choice that seemed to seal her fate. "You are the most breathtaking woman in this room," Roberto had whispered into her ear as they danced. His words and his touch had made her feel special, desired, and loved. What followed was a whirlwind romance: lavish dinners, spontaneous getaways, expensive gifts. Roberto had showered her with everything she could ever want. But looking back now, those days of bliss were tinged with a bitterness she couldn't ignore. There had been signs, subtle at first: late-night phone calls, mysterious text messages, last-minute cancellations that Roberto always explained away with his work. "The life of a top plastic surgeon is demanding," he had said, and she had believed him. How could she not? He was everything she had ever dreamed of and more. Their wedding had been the event of the year, a glamorous affair that left everyone in awe. But beneath the glittering surface, cracks had already begun to form. The honeymoon was when it all started to unravel. Roberto had been distant, constantly on his phone, dealing with what he claimed were emergencies at the clinic. The long hours he spent away from her, the coldness in his eyes when he finally did return, it all planted seeds of doubt that grew with each passing day. Back home, his absences became more frequent, his excuses more hollow. "I have to go," he would say. Another emergency, another patient in need, but Carolina knew now it wasn't the patients he was attending to. As she sat there staring at her reflection in the mirror, the woman looking back at her was no longer the captive. She was stronger, fiercer, ready to face whatever lies ahead. And she would. No longer would she live in the shadow of betrayal. Carolina had been reborn, and she was determined to uncover every secret, to lay bare every deceit. The perfect life she had once cherished was gone, but from its ashes she would rise. Carolina shook her head, pulling herself back to the grim reality she now faced. The truth, once a vague and haunting suspicion, had solidified into a cold, undeniable certainty. The sharp sting of betrayal gnawed at her heart, but it was the fiery rage boiling in her chest that gave her the strength to rise from the armchair. Gone was the compliant, trusting wife. In her place stood a woman who would stop at nothing to uncover every deceit, no matter how deep or painful. Roberto had played his game well, but Carolina was ready to change the rules, and when she did, he would regret every single lie he had spun. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled her lungs as Carolina stepped into the clinic's sleek, modern lobby. The atmosphere was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as her eyes locked onto Anna, Roberto's assistant. Anna, young and impeccably groomed, sat behind the counter, typing away with practiced efficiency. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her uniform pristine, a portrait of professional composure. But Carolina wasn't fooled. She approached the counter, her lips curling into a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Anna. Is my husband available?" Carolina's voice was sweet, almost too sweet, as she tilted her head ever so slightly. Anna's eyes widened in surprise, a flicker of nervousness betraying her calm demeanor. "Mrs. Carolina, we weren't expecting you today. The doctor is currently with a patient." Her words were smooth, but there was an underlying tension that Carolina didn't miss. Before she could respond, the office door creaked open and Roberto emerged, guiding a patient out with his usual polished charm. The moment his gaze landed on Carolina, a flicker of unease crossed his features, so brief that only someone looking for it would notice. "Carolina, what a surprise!" he exclaimed, leaning in to plant a quick kiss on her cheek. His voice was warm, but there was an edge to it, as if he were trying to mask his discomfort. "What brings you here?" Carolina smiled, though her eyes remained cold. "I thought I'd surprise you," she said, her tone light as she subtly observed how Anna's gaze dropped to the floor. Roberto glanced at Anna, who quickly busied herself with paperwork, avoiding Carolina's penetrating stare. The air was thick with unspoken tension as Roberto ushered Carolina into his office. "I only have a few minutes before my next appointment," Roberto said, closing the door behind them. His tone was brisk, almost hurried, as if he were eager to end the conversation before it even began. Carolina's eyes swept over the room, searching for any clue that would confirm her darkest fears. "I thought we could have lunched together," she suggested casually, though her mind was far from the suggestion. She watched Roberto closely, noting every flicker of emotion that crossed his face as he glanced at his schedule. "Unfortunately, I'm fully booked today," Roberto replied, his voice tinged with regret. Or was it just an excuse? Carolina's gaze fell on a lipstick tube resting on his desk, its vibrant color stark against the dark wood. "And what about this?" she asked, picking it up, her voice laced with feigned curiosity. The color drained from Roberto's face for a split second before he quickly regained his composure. "Oh, that," he replied with a forced chuckle. "It must belong to a patient. You know how they are, always leaving things behind." His explanation was smooth, but doubt had already taken root in Carolina's mind. Before she could press further, Anna knocked and entered, her eyes darting between Carolina and Roberto. "Doctor, your next patient is ready," Anna announced, her voice steady, though she avoided making eye contact with Carolina. Roberto nodded, exchanging a brief, loaded glance with Anna, a glance that lingered just a fraction of a second too long. "I'll see you at home, darling," Roberto said, placing a quick kiss on Carolina's forehead before hurrying out. Carolina watched him leave, her heart heavy with suspicion. The lipstick, the secretive looks, the underlying tension, they all pointed to something more, something deeper. But Carolina sensed that the truth was even more twisted than she had imagined. She would find out what Roberto was hiding, no matter what it cost her. Meanwhile, in the operating room, a thick tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Roberto, masked and focused, moved his hands with precise but strained control as he performed a delicate procedure on his patient's face. Dr. Antonia Vega, standing beside him, scrutinized his every move, her critical eyes missing nothing. "Careful with that incision," Roberto. Antonia warned in a low, firm voice. "You're dangerously close to the facial nerve." Roberto grunted, his hands trembling slightly despite his best efforts to remain composed. "I know what I'm doing, Antonia. I don't need you looking over my shoulder like I'm some intern." His voice was tense and defensive, and the silence that followed was thick with unspoken concerns. The nurses exchanged worried glances, sensing the undercurrent of stress radiating from Roberto. After what felt like an eternity, Roberto completed the final stitch, tore off his gloves with frustration, and stormed out of the operating room without a word. Antonia followed him, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she caught up with him in his office. "What the hell is going on with you, Roberto?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "You nearly botched that surgery. Do you realize how close you came to ruining that patient's face?" Roberto slumped into his chair, running a hand through his hair in exasperation. "I haven't been sleeping well," that's all he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Antonia's expression softened slightly, her concern evident. "Is it because of Carolina?" she asked gently, sensing there was more to his struggles than just fatigue. Roberto looked like he was on the verge of confiding in her, but the sudden ring of his phone interrupted the moment. He glanced at the screen, and his face went pale as a ghost. "I have to take this," he mumbled, avoiding Antonia's searching gaze. She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "This isn't over, Roberto," she warned him quietly. "You can't keep going like this. Your patience, your career, everything is on the line." With that, she left the office, leaving Roberto alone with his thoughts. He answered the call with trembling hands, his voice barely concealing his panic. "Yes, I understand. I'll have it ready by tomorrow, I promise." As he hung up, he stared blankly out the window, the weight of his lies pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Every secret, every deception he had woven now threatened to unravel everything he had worked for. Outside, the sky was bathed in a blood-red glow, the setting sun casting long shadows across the city. A shiver ran down Roberto's spine as the creeping realization set in his carefully crafted life was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The coffee steamed in Carolina's hands as she sat across from Laura on the terrace of her favorite cafe. The city's bustle seemed distant, drowned out by the weight of her worries. "I don't know what to do," Carolina confessed, her voice cracking slightly. "Every day I feel like Roberto is drifting further away from me." Laura reached across the table, squeezing her friend's hand gently. Her intense green eyes shone with apparent concern. "Tell me everything, Caro. You know you can trust me." Carolina inhaled deeply, struggling to steady the whirlwind of emotions churning within her. When she finally spoke, the words poured out in a desperate rush, as if they had been suffocating her for far too long. She confided in Laura about the disturbing scene she had witnessed while crouched under the bed, her gnawing doubts about Anna and Roberto's increasingly erratic behavior. Laura, visibly unsettled by Carolina's intensity, hesitated before offering a cautious suggestion. "Are you sure you're not overthinking this? Roberto is devoted to you." Everyone can see that, but Carolina's frustration boiled over, her head shaking in disbelief. "You don't get it," she said, her voice quivering with barely restrained emotion. "It's as if I'm living with a stranger. The secretive phone calls, his late-night returns, and that woman with the red heels, I can't ignore it anymore." Laura leaned in, her brow furrowing in concern. "Red heels? Are you certain you saw them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I saw," Carolina replied firmly, the memory burning vividly in her mind. "I heard them in our bedroom, Laura." The sound was unmistakable. A heavy silence fell between them, thick with unspoken fears. Laura's gaze drifted, her thoughts seemingly lost in a labyrinth of possibilities as her finger traced the rim of her coffee cup. Sensing the gravity of the situation, Carolina's resolve hardened. "I have to uncover the truth," she declared, her voice steeled with determination. "This uncertainty is devouring me from the inside out." Laura's eyes locked onto Carolina's, her expression inscrutable, as if she was weighing the weight of what was left unsaid. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her tone low and measured. "I'll help you, Carolina. We'll uncover what's happening together." A flicker of hope sparked within Carolina, a warmth she hadn't felt in days. She failed to notice, however, the way Laura's eyes darted away, or the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her purse. As they exchanged goodbyes, Carolina couldn't have imagined that she had just bared her deepest fears to the very person orchestrating her tumor. The betrayal cloaked in friendship hung over her like a dark cloud, heavy in foreboding. When Carolina returned home later that afternoon, the sun's golden rays filtered through the silk curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. The quiet stillness that greeted her was shattered only by the faint murmur of voices drifting from the kitchen. Her pulse quickened, her feet moving soundlessly as she crept closer. She strained to listen, her breath hitching as she caught the distressed tone of Maria, the housekeeper. "Mr. Roberto, I can't keep doing this. Mrs. Carolina is getting suspicious, and I don't want to be dragged into any mess." Maria's voice trembled with fear. Roberto's response was chillingly calm. his voice laced with a menacing edge Carolina had never heard before. "Calm down, Maria. Remember what we agreed upon. If you breathe a word, you'll lose everything." Carolina's blood ran cold, her mind racing to piece together the implications. What dark secret did Roberto share with Maria? Was there something between them? The thought was like a dagger to her heart. "But sir, the phone calls, the late-night visits. Miss Carolina isn't blind," Maria persisted, her voice cracking under the weight of her anxiety. "Just do as you're told," Roberto snapped, cutting her off sharply. "Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. I need to know every move Carolina makes." "Understood." Footsteps approached, and Carolina, in a panic, darted behind a nearby column. She watched as Roberto emerged from the kitchen, his expression hard and unreadable, only to soften into a warm smile the moment he saw her. "Darling, I didn't hear you come in," he said, pressing a kiss to her cheek. His touch felt like ice against her skin. "How was your afternoon with Laura?" Carolina forced a smile, swallowing the bitter taste of deception. "It was good. Good. Spending time with her is always a pleasure." Roberto nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, his eyes flicking to his watch. "I have to head back to the clinic. Don't wait up for me." As he left, the familiar ache of doubt settled in Carolina's chest, but now it was accompanied by a suffocating sense of dread. The suspicions that had once lingered on the fringes of her mind now loomed larger, casting long shadows that twisted into dark, unrecognizable shapes. When Maria appeared from the kitchen, visibly startled to see Carolina, she quickly masked her surprise. "Ma'am, I didn't realize you were home. Is there anything I can get you?" Carolina stared at her, searching for any sign, any crack in the facade that might confirm what she feared. "No, Maria, I'm fine. Thank you," she replied, her voice barely concealing the turmoil beneath. As she ascended the stairs to her room, the weight of unspoken truths and hidden lies bore down on her, each step heavier than the last. The nagging doubts had festered into a grim certainty her perfect life was nothing but an elaborate illusion, and she would stop at nothing to tear it down, regardless of the cost. The study was shrouded in shadows when Carolina slipped in quietly, the dim light barely illuminating the room. A heavy sense of guilt weighed on her, knowing full well that it was wrong to pry into her husband's private matters. But the gnawing need for answers overpowered her conscience. With trembling fingers, she hesitantly reached for the desk lamp, its sudden glow slicing through the darkness. Her heart raced as she began rifling through the drawers, her movements frantic and desperate. Bills and receipts piled up in her hands, mundane and unremarkable, until her fingers brushed against something peculiar. Hidden away at the very back of the bottom drawer was a folder, nearly invisible to the casual observer. Her breath caught as she opened it, eyes widening in utter disbelief. Inside were bank statements and wire transfers to offshore accounts, vast sums of money that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared, with no clear explanation. Carolina's chest tightened, her breath coming in shallow gasps. How could this be happening? Where was this money coming from, and more terrifyingly, where was it going? One document, in particular, sent a cold shiver down her spine, a loan agreement for an obscene amount, signed by Roberto in a name that filled her with dread: Alejandro Montero. In polite society, Montero was known as a shrewd businessman, but whispers in the shadows painted him as something far darker, a ruthless loan shark with a reputation for violence. The sudden sound of Roberto's voice shattered the silence. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, standing in the doorway, his face a volatile mix of fury and panic. Carolina's heart lurched as she turned to face him, holding up the damning papers with trembling hands. "What is all of this, Roberto?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is this money coming from? And why do you owe so much to Alejandro Montero?" The room seemed to shrink as Roberto approached her, closing the door with a slow, deliberate movement. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "You shouldn't have seen that, Carolina. You have no idea what kind of trouble you're stirring up." "What kind of trouble I'm stirring up?" she retorted, her voice quivering with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'm your wife, Roberto. If you're in danger, I have a right to know." Roberto snatched the documents from her hands, his grip tightening around them. "This is bigger than us, Carolina," he said through gritted teeth. "There are people involved who won't think twice about hurting you if they find out you know anything." Carolina stared at him, her fear slowly hardening into resolve. "You can't shut me out any longer, Roberto. I deserve the truth, all of it now." The air between them grew thick with tension. the weight of unspoken secrets pressing down on them. Roberto's face was a mask of inner turmoil, caught between the urge to confess and the need to protect his wife from the dark reality he had been hiding. Finally, with a deep, resigned sigh, he began to unravel the tale. It all started a year ago with a bad investment. The hours slipped away as Carolina listened, her horror mounting with each revelation. The life she thought she knew was crumbling before her eyes, replaced by a terrifying web of deceit, debt, and danger. Later, Carolina sat in a small cafe, staring blankly out the window. Her untouched coffee had long gone cold, much like the warmth in her heart. Across from her, Laura watched with growing concern, the tension between them palpable. "Caro, you're scaring me," Laura said softly, reaching across the table to squeeze her friend's hand. "What happened? What did Roberto say?" Carolina blinked, dragging herself out of the fog of despair that clouded her thoughts. Her red-rimmed eyes, swollen from crying, met Laura's. "It's so much worse than I ever imagined, Laura," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Roberto is tangled up in something horrifying." Laura leaned closer, her voice a hushed murmur. "What do you mean?" "Is it another woman?" Carolina let out a bitter laugh, devoid of any joy. "I wish it were that simple. Roberto is in deep. He owes a fortune to some very dangerous people. He's been stealing from the clinic, performing illegal surgeries just to keep up with the payments." Laura's face paled as the gravity of the situation sunk in. "Oh my God, Caro. Are you sure?" Carolina nodded, her voice breaking under the strain. "I saw everything with my own eyes, the documents, the transactions. It's all right there in black and white." Laura tightened her grip on Carolina's hand, searching for the right words. "What are you going to do?" Carolina was silent for a long moment, battling the tears that threatened to spill over. "I don't know," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible. "Part of me wants to run, to leave all this behind. But another part wants to fight, to uncover every last shred of truth." As they sat in the cafe, the world outside moved on as if nothing had changed, but for Carolina, nothing would ever be the same. Laura's eyes bore into Carolina with a gaze that was hard to decipher, a swirl of emotions flitting across her face. "Caro, you need to tread carefully here. If what you're saying is true, you're up against some seriously dangerous people." Carolina swallowed hard and nodded, the gravity of her situation weighing heavily on her. "I know, Laura, but I can't just stand by and ignore it. I need to uncover the truth, no matter where it leads or who else is involved." Laura leaned back in her chair, her expression turning distant as she considered the implications. After a moment, she spoke, her voice low. "Maybe there's a way I can help. I know someone, a private detective. He's discreet and can dig into this quietly." Carolina's weary eyes lit up with a flicker of hope, a rare emotion in the storm of dread she had been navigating. "Would you do that for me, Laura?" she asked, her voice trembling with both fear and relief. Laura forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, Caro. That's what friends are for, right?" As they left the cafe, Carolina felt a small but significant weight lift from her shoulders. The knowledge that she wasn't alone in this dark, twisting nightmare gave her the strength to keep pushing forward. With Laura by her side, perhaps she could finally begin to untangle the sinister web that threatened to suffocate her. Yet what Carolina couldn't see, what Laura kept hidden behind a mask of concern, was the flicker of guilt and fear that crossed her face as they embraced goodbye. The betrayal, carefully concealed under layers of supposed friendship, continued its quiet, deadly course. Later that day, the clinic was buzzing with activity, but it all seemed distant and surreal to Carolina. She sat in the waiting room, her large sunglasses obscuring the anguish etched into her features, her eyes locked on Anna, Roberto's ever-efficient assistant. The woman moved with purpose, her expression blank and professional, giving nothing away. But Carolina knew better now. She had the information the detective had unearthed that very morning. Ana Velasco, a 28-year-old with a troubling past. 3 clinics in 2 years, each shuttered under the cloud of financial scandal and irregularities. Determined, Carolina stood and approached the counter, her steps purposeful, her voice firm. "I need to speak with Ana, please." "It's urgent." Anna looked up, recognition flashing in her eyes before she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Mrs. Carolina, Dr. Roberto isn't in at the moment." "I'm not here for Roberto," Carolina interrupted, her tone sharp. "I need to speak with you." Alone, something in her voice must have struck a chord because Anna's face paled, and she nodded stiffly, leading Carolina to a small, empty office nearby. "How can I help you?" Anna asked, her voice tinged with unease as she closed the door behind them. Carolina removed her sunglasses, her gaze piercing. "I want the truth, Anna, the real truth, about Roberto. The illegal surgeries, the money disappearing from the clinic's accounts. No more lies. Anna backed away slightly, her back hitting the desk as fear clouded her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Oh, I think you do, Carolina pressed, stepping closer. 3 clinics, Anna. All closed under suspicious circumstances right after you worked there. That's no coincidence. Anna's resolve crumbled, her face contorting with fear and regret. Please, you don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm just following orders. If I talked before she could finish, the door flew open with a bang, and Roberto stormed in, his face twisted in a mix of fury and fear. Carolina, what the hell are you doing here? He snarled, his eyes darting between his wife and his terrified assistant. Carolina straightened, meeting his gaze with steely determination. I'm uncovering the truth. Roberto, the truth you've been hiding from me. Roberto's eyes darkened as he looked at Anna, who was visibly trembling. Leave us, he ordered, his voice cold and commanding. Anna hurried out of the room, leaving Carolina and Roberto alone, the tension between them palpable. You're playing a dangerous game, Carolina, Roberto warned, his voice low and menacing. You have no idea how deep this goes. More dangerous than living a lie, Carolina shot back, her voice rising with anger. I know about the illegal surgeries, Roberto. I know you're laundering money through the clinic. Roberto's face drained of color, panic flickering in his eyes. Keep your voice down, he hissed, glancing around as if someone might be listening. If anyone hears you, what will they do? Carolina challenged, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. Make me disappear like those patients who never survived your special treatments. The silence that followed was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken truths. Roberto's shoulders slumped, the weight of his secrets finally breaking him. Go home, Carolina, he said wearily, his voice a mere shadow of its former strength. We'll talk tonight. I'll tell you everything. As she walked out of the clinic, Carolina felt the world shift beneath her feet, each step taking her further away from the life she once knew. The truth was slowly coming to light, dark, twisted, and more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. There was no turning back now. The oppressive quiet of the clinic was suddenly shattered by the loud slam of a door. Carolina, who had been waiting anxiously in the hallway, flinched in surprise as a man stormed out of Roberto's office, his voice filled with rage and pain. You're a damned butcher, he screamed, his face a grotesque tapestry of poorly healed scars. You promised you'd fix it. And look at me now, Roberto followed quickly, his expression frantic as he tried to placate the furious man. Mr. Mendez, please calm down. We can fix this, I swear. Fix this, Mendez bellowed, his voice thick with despair. You've ruined my life. My wife left me, I lost my job, and all because I trusted you. Carolina watched the scene unfold in horror, her stomach turning at the sight of Mendez's disfigured face, so far from the perfect results Roberto had always boasted about. I'll refund your money, Roberto muttered, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I just need a little more time. But even as the words left his mouth, Carolina knew there was no fixing this, no repairing the damage that had been done. The darkness Roberto had dragged them into was too deep, too dangerous, and it was closing in on them all. Mendez let out a hollow, scornful laugh that reverberated through the tense air. You believe that money can solve this mess, he spat with venomous contempt, his eyes blazing with fury as he loomed closer to Roberto, a figure radiating unrestrained menace. I swear I'll dismantle you, you butcher. I will expose the vile, corrupt reality of this wretched clinic for everyone to see. As if summoned by his rage, 2 imposing security guards emerged, flanking Mendez with an air of authority. Please, sir, one of them intoned firmly, we need to take you outside. As they dragged Mendez away, his voice still echoing with threats and indignation, Roberto's gaze fell upon Carolina, who had just witnessed the tumult. The color drained from Roberto's already ashen face, leaving him pallid and stricken. Carolina, you shouldn't have witnessed this, he said, stepping toward her with a desperate, fleeting look. What shouldn't I have witnessed, she demanded, her voice quivering with a mix of righteous fury and raw fear. The shattered life of a man you've devastated, or the damning evidence that everything you've claimed about your work is a fabrication? Roberto reached out to take her arm, but she jerked away, her movement sharp and decisive. It's not what it seems. Let me explain, he stammered, desperation evident in his eyes. Explain what? Carolina cut him off with a voice tinged with bitter disbelief. How you're wrecking lives, or how you're jeopardizing ours. Before Roberto could utter a single word, Antonia burst into the hallway, urgency etched in her features. Roberto, we have a critical situation in the operating room. You must come now. Roberto's gaze darted between Carolina, whose eyes brimmed with disillusionment, and Antonia, whose urgent tone left no room for delay. "I have to go," he murmured, a heavy sense of resignation in his voice. "We'll talk when I get home, I swear." As Roberto rushed away, Carolina felt a profound sense of betrayal, as if the very ground beneath her had crumbled. The realization that Roberto's deceit was not merely a personal betrayal, but a catalyst for the destruction of innocent lives left her heart heavy with anguish. With tears of frustration and resolve streaming down her face, Carolina exited the clinic, her mindset ablaze with determination to uncover the truth, no matter the personal cost. What Carolina was about to discover would plunge her into a maelstrom of peril, forever altering the course of her life. The clinic's atmosphere was suffocating, laden with a heavy silence that seemed to press against her chest as she stormed into Roberto's office. The receptionist's futile attempt to bar her entry was met with Carolina's unwavering resolve. She barged through the doors, driven by a fierce determination. The scene that greeted her was chilling and surreal. Roberto sat in his leather chair, his once pristine shirt marred by dark, ominous stains of blood. A jagged cut marred his cheek, and his eyes, once confident and assured, now mirrored a profound sense of fear and confusion. Carolina felt her breath catch in her throat. "What on earth happened to you?" she demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of horror and concern as she slammed the door shut behind her. Roberto attempted to muster a reassuring smile, but it contorted into a grimace of agony. "It's nothing, my love. Just a minor incident in the operating room." Carolina's gaze swept over the chaotic scene. Papers lay strewn across the floor. A shattered vase lay in pieces, and the room bore unmistakable signs of a violent altercation. "Stop deceiving me, Roberto. This was no accident." Defeat etched itself across Roberto's features as he slumped into his chair. "I can't explain, Carolina. If I do, you'll be in grave danger." "Graver than the danger we're already in," she retorted, her voice a trembling mix of fear and anger. "I'm aware of the nighttime visits, the illicit money transactions, the forbidden surgeries. What else are you hiding from me?" Roberto's eyes, filled with a palpable dread, locked onto hers. "These people are ruthless, Carolina. They've ensnared me in their grasp. If I don't comply with their demands..." His words were cut short by the shrill ringing of his phone. His face drained of what little color remained as he glanced at the screen. "I need to take this call," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "No," Carolina interjected with steely resolve, snatching the phone from his trembling hands. "No more lies. Reveal everything to me now." Roberto stood unsteadily, his voice laced with desperation. "Please, Carolina, hand it back. If I don't answer, they'll come after us." The terror in his voice was palpable, and Carolina felt the walls of her reality begin to crumble around her. Her world was spinning, caught in a web of deceit and danger, and she knew she was standing on the precipice of something far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. With a heavy heart and steely determination, she braced herself for the storm that was about to engulf them. The sense of dread that enveloped Carolina grew increasingly suffocating. It was unmistakable now. These were not mere acquaintances or neutral figures. They were the very men who had taken Roberto, or perhaps their sinister counterparts, dispatched by the shadowy orchestrator of this nightmare. "Maria, listen to me very carefully," Carolina said, her voice steady but urgent as she gripped the maid's shoulders. "You need to go home immediately. Take a taxi, not the bus, and don't return until I call you. Do you understand?" Maria's face was a canvas of bewilderment and fear, but she nodded her compliance swiftly. The house fell into a heavy, oppressive silence. Carolina moved through each room with methodical precision, drawing curtains and double-checking locks, her mind racing in a chaotic whirl of anxiety and desperation. Who could she turn to in this labyrinth of deceit? Who could she trust? The abrupt ringing of the phone shattered the silence like a jarring alarm. Carolina hesitated, her heart pounding with trepidation. With a hand trembling from both fear and resolve, she picked up the receiver. "Hello," she managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. Carolina Roberto's voice crackled through the line, strained and laced with palpable terror. "Listen closely. I'm okay, but I can't come home. I need you to." The call was abruptly severed, leaving Carolina clutching the receiver in stunned silence. Panic surged within her as the sound of a car engine roaring to life echoed outside. The stillness was shattered. The threat was no longer abstract, it was immediate and encroaching. Carolina understood with chilling clarity that she was no longer safe, even within the supposed sanctuary of her own home. The web of deceit and peril was closing in around her, and she found herself ensnared at the heart of it. The coffee sat steaming and untouched before Carolina as she faced Laura across the table. The cafe's lively clamor seemed a stark contrast to the intense tension that crackled between the two friends. "I can't endure this any longer," Laura Carolina confessed, her voice fraught with weary despair. "Every day reveals something more horrifying. Roberto is missing. Men are lurking around the house. It feels like I'm unraveling." Laura reached out with a comforting gesture, her fingers gently squeezing Carolina's hand. "Take a deep breath, Caro." "It's done," she murmured into the phone, her voice a tight whisper of relief mingled with trepidation. "She's agreed to hire the detective. Everything is falling into place as planned." Unbeknownst to her, the noose of the trap was steadily tightening around Carolina, and in her frantic quest for the truth, she was unwittingly walking into a perilous snare. Detective Ramirez's office was thick with the oppressive stench of stale tobacco and the acrid tang of cold coffee. Carolina fidgeted anxiously in the worn leather chair, her nerves frayed as she watched the detective, his face etched with the lines of countless investigations, methodically sift through a disordered stack of documents. Mrs. Alarcon Ramirez's gruff voice shattered the silence, each word laden with gravity. "What I've uncovered about your husband is deeply troubling, to say the least." Carolina's heart pounded in her chest as she leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the detective with desperate intensity. "Please, tell me everything you found out." With deliberate precision, Ramirez spread a series of photographs across the desk. Each image depicted Roberto in various locations around the city, always in the company of men whose menacing demeanor spoke volumes. "Your husband," Ramirez said, his voice grim, "is deeply entangled with the Montero cartel. He isn't just a minor player or a peripheral figure, he's deeply immersed in their operations." A chill seized Carolina as the words sank in. "The cartel? How is this even possible?" "Why?" Ramirez continued, his tone heavy with the weight of his findings. "Dr. Alarcon has been involved in performing plastic surgeries to alter the appearances of cartel members. Moreover, his clinic is being exploited for laundering drug money." The revelation hit Carolina with the force of a physical blow. The troubling images of discontented patients, dubious bank transactions, and those ominous nighttime visits suddenly coalesced into a nightmarish clarity. "There's more." Ramirez's voice grew even darker. "We've also discovered ties between the cartel and several other doctors in the city. Dr. Antonia Vega, for instance, appears to be implicated as well." Carolina's mind raced back to the scene she had witnessed Antonia's heated exchange with that shadowy figure. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in a horrifyingly coherent pattern. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. Ramirez's gaze was piercing, his concern palpable. "Mrs. Alarcon, you need to understand that you're now in an extremely precarious situation. The cartel is ruthless and unforgiving. They will do anything to protect their interests. And right now you are entangled in their web. You must proceed with utmost caution." Carolina, Roberto whispered urgently, shutting the door behind him with a decisive click. "I didn't expect to find you here." "It's time for the truth, Roberto," she declared, her voice unwavering despite the tremor in her hands. "I know everything: the cartel, the illegal surgeries, the money laundering." Roberto sank into the chair opposite her, his facade of composure disintegrating as he met her steely gaze. "How?" "It doesn't matter," Carolina cut him off, her tone steely. "I need to hear it from you. All of it. Now." A heavy silence filled the room as Roberto struggled to find his voice. Finally, he began, his words fractured and heavy with regret. "It began 2 years ago. The clinic was on the brink of collapse, and I was drowning in debt. Alejandro Montero came to me, offering an escape." Carolina's heart pounded as Roberto recounted his descent into the cartel's web, how he had become an instrument in their operations, performing surgeries to disguise criminals, utilizing the clinic to launder their illicit gains, and even participating in their drug trafficking schemes. "How could you do this?" Carolina's voice was barely more than a whisper, tears of fury and betrayal streaming down her face. "How could you endanger us all for money and luxury?" "I did it for us," Roberto stammered, his voice wavering. "To preserve our way of life, too." "Don't you dare try to justify this," Carolina snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "I never asked for any of this, not at the cost of innocent lives." At that moment, the harsh screech of tires on the street jolted them both. Roberto's face went ashen. "It's them," he said, his voice trembling with dread. "Carolina, you need to leave immediately." "Who are they?" Carolina demanded, her voice rising in alarm. "The cartel," Roberto replied, shoving her toward a concealed back door. "They know I've been talking. If they find you here." The forceful crash of the front door being breached cut through the room, sending a wave of terror through Carolina. She looked at Roberto, seeing for the first time the raw, unmasked fear in his eyes. "Go," he implored, his voice filled with desperation. "Please, you have to get out of here. I'll explain everything later, but right now, you're in grave danger." Laura hesitated, her eyes darting away from Carolina's piercing gaze. I knew a bit about this situation," she began, her voice quivering. "Roberto reached out to me several months ago. He asked me to keep tabs on you, to track your every move and report back to him." Carolina's hands recoiled sharply, her expression one of utter shock and disbelief. "You've been spying on me," she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "It wasn't quite like that," Laura quickly protested, desperation lacing her words. "Initially, I only meant to look out for you, to keep you safe, but then things spiraled." A vivid memory struck Carolina with the force of a tidal wave: red stilettos, the lingering scent of high-end perfume, and Maria's unsettling account of the enigmatic nighttime visitor. "It was you," Carolina whispered, her voice barely audible as the realization crashed over her like a freezing storm. "The woman visiting Roberto, you were his lover." Laura's gaze fell, her silence a stark confession. "I'm so sorry, Caro," she murmured, her voice laden with regret. "I never intended for it to end up like this." Carolina's world seemed to tilt violently as she stood up, overwhelmed by a torrent of betrayal. Her best friend, her most trusted confidante, had turned out to be a traitor, inflicting the deepest wound imaginable. "Carolina, wait," Laura pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation as she reached out. "Please, let me explain." But Carolina was already moving away, her vision clouded by tears. The person she had once trusted above all others had turned out to be an integral part of the deceit that had shattered her world. She felt an agonizing solitude, engulfed by a sea of lies and treachery. As Carolina stood on the rooftop of the building where Laura lived, the bitter wind lashed against her face, a stark contrast to the warmth she had once associated with her former friend. She had followed Laura here, her resolve hardened by the need for one final confrontation. "Carolina," Laura's voice was a mix of shock and fear as she saw her, her face paling. "What are you doing here?" "I've come for the truth," Carolina declared, her voice quivering with barely contained fury. "All of it, unfiltered and raw." Laura's eyes darted around anxiously, her demeanor betraying her search for an escape route. "I've already told you everything at the cafe," she stammered. "Lies," Carolina interrupted, her voice cutting through the night air with steely resolve. "Complicated," Carolina spat, her voice edged with fury. "Is that what you call shattering my marriage and destroying my entire life?" Laura's composure finally cracked, her face contorting with anguish as she shouted back. "You don't understand," she cried. "Roberto promised me a new beginning, a fresh start far from all this misery. He said we'd escape together, that." Carolina's rage erupted violently. She slapped Laura with such force that the sound echoed sharply against the frigid air of the rooftop. "And you believed him?" Carolina demanded, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You thought a man who could betray his wife would remain faithful to his mistress?" Laura clutched her stinging cheek, her eyes overflowing with tears. "I'm so sorry, Carolina. I never intended for any of this. Things spiraled beyond my control." Spiraled beyond control, Carolina's voice was a tremor of rage and despair. "Roberto is missing, possibly dead. Criminals are hunting me. My entire existence has been shattered. And you dare to say things just got out of control." The sudden wail of sirens in the distance cut through their confrontation like a sharp knife. Laura's face went ashen. "We need to leave," she urged, grabbing at Carolina's arm in panic. "If they find us here." "There is no way," Carolina said coldly, wrenching her arm away. "You made your choice. Now deal with the fallout." As she turned toward the rooftop door, Carolina heard Laura's desperate cry pierce through the cold air. "Carolina, please. Don't leave me like this." But Carolina didn't glance back. The final link to her past had been severed, leaving her completely alone. Yet for the first time in a long while, she felt an unexpected liberation from the web of deception that had ensnared her. The sun was sinking low over the city when Carolina stepped into the apartment she had once shared with Roberto. The silence was heavy, the only sound the relentless ticking of the wall clock. Each corner of the space seemed to whisper remnants of a life now distant and alien. With shaking hands, she began to sort through her belongings. Each object she touched ignited a torrent of emotion, photos of supposed joy that now seemed like cruel illusions, Roberto's hidden deceit and betrayal lurking behind every smile. The creak of the door opening startled her from her reverie. She turned. The opulent restaurant thrummed with the clatter of cutlery and the murmur of conversations. But for Roberto and Laura, ensconced in a dimly lit corner, the outside world had become a distant memory. Their once vibrant faces were now pallid and etched with anxiety, a stark contrast to the restaurant's refined ambience. "I can hardly believe it's come to this," Laura said quietly, her fingers nervously tracing patterns around the stem of her wine glass. "Carolina." "Don't mention her," Roberto snapped, his voice edged with urgency. "There's no going back now." Just then, a man clad in a dark, tailored suit approached their table, his presence commanding immediate attention. His steely gaze and unyielding posture sent a shiver through both Roberto and Laura. "Dr. Alarcon," the man intoned, his voice deep and authoritative. "Mr. Montero requires your presence immediately." Roberto's face tightened as he nodded, his throat working as he swallowed his apprehension. "Of course." "Laura, stay here." With that, Roberto followed the man, leaving Laura alone with a roiling tempest of guilt and dread. Time seemed to stretch interminably as she sat in tense solitude. When Roberto finally reappeared, his face was ghostly, his steps unsteady. He sank into his chair, gulping down a generous sip of wine as if seeking solace in its bitter taste. "What happened?" Laura's voice was laden with concern as she leaned in, her eyes searching his face for answers. "We're in grave danger," Roberto whispered hoarsely. "Montero's aware of the police investigation. He's convinced we've spilled something." Laura's heart sank, her world tilting precariously. "But we haven't. We wouldn't betray anyone." "It doesn't matter," Roberto said, running a trembling hand through his disheveled hair. "They're demanding one final task from us, something monumental, perilous. If we succeed, we're free. If we fail..." He let the ominous implication hang in the air. Laura reached out, grasping his hand in a desperate bid for reassurance. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. Roberto met her gaze, his eyes a tumultuous sea of fear and resolve. "We have no choice," he said with grim determination. "We'll comply with their demands, and then we'll vanish from this life forever." The gravity of their predicament settled over them like an oppressive shroud. The vision of a serene future together, once so tantalizingly close, now felt like an elusive mirage, slipping further away with each passing moment. Laura's gaze held a flicker of hope, her voice trembling as she asked, "You'll help us?" Carolina took a deep breath, the weight of her decision settling heavily on her shoulders. "Not directly," she replied, "but I have a contact in the police whom I trust implicitly. I'll provide them with everything I know about the cartel. Maybe they can make a difference if you cooperate fully." Laura's eyes widened with apprehension. "But the cartel, they're dangerous. What if they find out?" "Oh, what if they find out?" "It's your only option," Carolina said firmly, cutting through Laura's fear, "unless you want to spend the rest of your lives fleeing and hiding from them." Laura nodded slowly, her face a mask of resignation mixed with gratitude. "Thank you, Carolina. I know we don't deserve this chance, but thank you." As Laura departed, Carolina remained by the window, feeling the heavy burden of her choice. She had opted for the path of empathy rather than vengeance, a path fraught with uncertainty and moral complexity. She wasn't sure if she had chosen wisely, but she knew it was the only way she could live with herself and find some semblance of peace. The night deepened, casting long shadows over the city, and with it came the uncertain future that loomed over everyone entangled in this tragic saga. The following evening, the sunset bathed the city in a warm, orange glow as Carolina sat on the park bench, the same one where she had shared countless moments of laughter and camaraderie with Laura. Next to her lay a folder brimming with crucial documents, its weight a constant reminder of the gravity of her decision. She glanced at her watch, her heart pounding with anticipation. In a few minutes, Detective Ramirez would arrive to collect the information that could dismantle the cartel and potentially alter Roberto and Laura's fate. As she waited, Carolina's mind drifted back over the tumultuous months that had passed, the gut-wrenching betrayal, the soul-crushing revelation of lies, the profound isolation that had followed the collapse of her once stable life. And now here she was, on the brink of offering assistance to those who had inflicted such deep wounds upon her. Detective Ramirez appeared on the path, his demeanor solemn and weary. He took a seat next to Carolina, his silence a testament to the seriousness of the situation. "Here it is," Carolina said, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling within her. She handed him the folder, her fingers trembling slightly. "Inside, you'll find names, dates, locations, everything I know about the cartel and Roberto's involvement." Ramirez flipped through the documents, his eyes widening as he absorbed the depth of the information before him. And there you have it, the gripping conclusion to this intense and emotional journey. We've witnessed betrayal, the weight of tough decisions, and the struggle between vengeance and compassion. From the tension-filled encounters to the ultimate choice Carolina makes, this story reminds us of the complexities of human relationships and the consequences of our actions. So what have you learned from this narrative? How have these twists and turns impacted your view on trust, betrayal, and redemption? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share one thing you've learned and how you plan to apply it in your own life in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your comment and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more engaging content. Your support means the world to us.